We are in the middle of, or coming towards the end of, a series on the miracles of Jesus. And today we're going to continue that. We're going to look at this miracle that Pastor Merrill just introduced for us, Jesus' first miracle, the miracle where at the wedding he turns water into wine. And if you've got your Bibles, we're going to be in John chapter 2. And so if you want to turn there, you can also follow along on the YouVersion Bible app if you have that there. The notes should be there ready to go, and you can follow along. The process there on the screen shows you how to log into that. And so as we look at this miracle today, what I want to help us to see is how Jesus works in the very, very ordinariness of life and does extraordinary things when we allow him to, when we trust him, when we obey him. And we'll look at that process very clearly here. Let's jump into the passage. John chapter 2, right at the first verse 1, tells us this. On the third day, a wedding took place in Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. So this was, I want to say, an ordinary wedding. I don't mean that weddings are ordinary, but it was just a regular wedding. And weddings take place like every week around the place. I was at one last weekend as well, the same one that Merrill was at, and a few other people from here. This wedding was of no one in particular. We're not told who it is. We don't know whose wedding this was. And in this miracle, it was very ordinary water that was used. Water, we know, is one of the most common things on this planet. Water has no colour, no taste, no smell. 70% of the Earth's surface is covered in water. 70% of us, we're made up of water. And what Jesus is dealing with here is the most common of things, water. And He's using it dealing with it in one of the most common family settings or gatherings, a wedding, a typical family gathering, a wedding. And I love this because Jesus specializes in working in ordinary settings with ordinary people. Sometimes when we read the scriptures, we think, that Roman centurion or that Jewish leader or that, poor person by the side of the road, with leprosy. I don't know anyone with leprosy. So Jesus works in those kind of extreme circumstances. But actually, as we read through the Gospels and see the life of Jesus, he works with ordinary people in ordinary settings with ordinary things. And when he's allowed to work, when we give over to him, when we listen and obey, those ordinary circumstances become quite extraordinary. So this wedding took place in Cana in Galilee, and it says Jesus and his disciples were invited. Well, we don't know how many disciples that Jesus had at this time, but we do know that he picked up about 5 in the last few days, the last 5 days. John, he writes his first few chapters of his gospel kind of a bit like a diary. There's he says things like the next day this and the next day that and then 2 days later this, and on the third day this chapter starts with, right? And so in the last 5 days, we know that he's met Philip, he's met Nathaniel, he's met Simon Peter, he's met Andrew, and another disciple his name's not mentioned yet, but we know that he's a disciple of John the Baptist, who's become now a disciple of Jesus. So there's 5 disciples at least who are with Jesus invited to this wedding. The rest of the disciples are yet to be, met and called and gathered together. But it says that Jesus and his disciples were invited to the wedding, But interestingly, it says Mary was also there. It says Mary was also there. Jesus and his disciples were invited, but Mary was also there. She was there. And it looks as though maybe she was there helping with the arrangements, maybe with the catering, because she seems to somehow know something that the other guests don't know. What was that? They've run out of wine. So not only that, she seems to have some authority over the servants there when she tells them what they should do. So we can surmise from the context there that she was possibly one who was kind of helping out with all the wedding preparations and goings on. Likely because of that, it may well have been a wedding of a family member or a close family friend, because Jesus again and his disciples are invited, but Mary's there helping out. The key point, however, is however long this wedding had been going on, and weddings in those days would have extended over several days. They're not like a couple of hours like ours, but several days long, because people would have to travel, and they would travel from long distances to come together. And of course, for the wedding last weekend, some of us traveled long distances, but with planes or cars, and so we get there quickly and get home quickly. It's a different story when it's by camel or donkey or foot. And so traveling for days, maybe weeks to get to this wedding, you don't want it to be over in a couple of hours. So a couple of days, potentially this wedding had been going for, this celebration of the coming together of this couple. But however long it had been, at this point where we're reading today, they had run out of wine. And Mary comes to Jesus in verse 3 and said to him, they have no more wine. Now, whether this was bad planning or that extra people had turned up, we don't know. But what we know is that this was a huge embarrassment for the host. I mean, just imagine that you invite a family over to your house for dinner, and you think that there's only 2 coming, but 5 turn up. I mean, I had a family over last night. I thought 5 were coming and 3 turned up. So that's the better way for it to go. But if it's the reverse and you don't have enough, it's embarrassing, right? Now multiply that into an environment, into a culture where hospitality is key. Hospitality was just so much a more significant way of doing life than what we even think. Sometimes people will come and visit us and we don't even invite them inside the house. We just chat on the doorstep and go our separate ways. Well, that would never happen in that environment. You'd be welcomed in, you'd be given a robe, you'd have your feet washed, you'd be given a place of honor, food would be brought out. Just think Greek families, eat more food. And so it would have been a huge embarrassment for them that they had run out of wine at this wedding celebration with all the family and friends there together. And Mary was aware of this. She was the one who seems to have first become aware of this and alerted others to this problem, which is why I imagine that she was probably helping with the catering and had some kind of involvement and authority there. And so she comes and she tells Jesus. And his reply is quite interesting. In verse 4, Jesus says, "Woman, why do you involve me? My hour has not yet come." Now, you could preach a whole sermon series on that statement, but what I do want to say about that is that although it sounds a bit abrupt, almost dismissive, those words of Mary, Jesus' mother, I need to tell you that very much this is just the way the English language translates what was actually written there in Greek and what Jesus would have initially said. Jesus is not being rude or dismissive of his mother in the way he speaks to her there. But at the end of that interaction, brief interaction with Jesus, Mary telling Jesus there's no wine left, they've run out of wine, and Jesus saying, why are you involving me in this? Mary is left with no indication, no certainty, no promise that Jesus would do anything about it. Have you noticed that? In that moment, Mary leaves not having any confirmation that Jesus was going to do anything about it. But what she does know is that if he does respond, if he does do something, it's going to be important. So in verse 5, she said to the servants, again with no indication that Jesus was going to do anything, she says to the servants, do whatever he tells you to do. Do whatever he tells you. No question, just do it. If Jesus speaks, do what he says. Now remember, Jesus is just 30 years old at this point. He begins his public ministry at 30 years old. He's never performed a miracle, not that we know of. Mary, as his mother, has watched him for 30 years and has never seen a miracle, not that's recorded. His brothers and sisters, in fact, when Jesus began his public ministry, they were caught off guard. This is not what they expected. It took some time for his siblings to believe in him as the Messiah, as the Son of God. Growing up, they had not really known who he really was. Mary knew, but she kept these things and pondered them in her heart, Scripture tells us. They never really talked openly about who he was. Mary had never seen him perform a miracle anywhere, but she knows enough to say, whatever he says, do it. You see, when Jesus speaks, as his followers, whatever he says, we're to do it. This is great advice for each one of us as believers in Jesus, as followers of him. Whatever he says, do it. Verse 6, nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used for Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding 20 to 30 gallons, we're told, about 100 litres in Australian. Jesus said to the servants, fill the jars with water, just as Mary had instructed them to do. Whatever he says, do it. So they filled these jars to the brim. And today I want to show you from this passage 3 important principles that enable the ordinariness of our lives to reveal the extraordinariness of Jesus. And the first thing I want to point to you is that when Jesus is about to do something extraordinary, he begins by giving a command. When Jesus is about to do something extraordinary, he begins by giving a command. Now, this happens right through Scripture, specifically right through the Gospels with Jesus. In this case, fill the jars with water was his command. And sometimes his command may seem small, or it may seem to not make sense to us. I mean, fill the jars with water. They didn't need water. What they needed was wine. But Jesus' plan for them was for them to deal with the water and to leave it up to him to provide the wine. If they did the ordinary, he would do the extraordinary. In fact, in almost every single miracle of Jesus, a command needs to be obeyed before his power is seen. Every act of God is preceded by an act of obedience at some point. For example, when the royal official's son in John chapter 4 comes to Jesus and says, my son is lying sick at home, Jesus says, go home, your son is well. And he turns around and he goes home and he finds, after an act of obedience, going home, he finds his son healed. John chapter 6, you've got the feeding of the 5,000. And Jesus says to his disciples, take the loaves and distribute them. They probably thought 5 loaves, 2 fish. I mean, these aren't going to go very far. But as they began to obey and distribute the loaves, they began to multiply. And they had enough for all and plenty left over. When Jesus met the blind man in John chapter 9, he made some mud from the clay and spit. We talked about that a few weeks back. And he says to this man, go and wash in the pool of Siloam. And as he acted in obedience, his sight was restored. There's the command of God, and then there is the release of his power in some miraculous way. You see, we're not just passive observers of the work of Jesus. We don't just sit back and do nothing. We join with him. It's our obedience to his command that releases then the power of God to work in our lives. And so when Jesus is about to do something extraordinary, he usually gives a command of some kind first. That's the first thing that we want to take notice from this as we think about how to apply this miracle in our own lives. Second thing to take notice of is that when Jesus gives a command, we need to follow it fully. We need to follow it fully. Did you notice that when Jesus tells the servants to fill the jars with water, they filled them to the brim? I mean, you can't be more obedient than to fill something all the way to the top. I mean, they could have filled it 3/4, they could have filled it 90%, they could have filled it 99%, but they filled it to the brim. They didn't say, we're only going to go part way in obeying. They filled it all the way up, right to the very top. And sometimes we wonder why we see so little of God working in our lives when our obedience to him is only half-hearted. We say, sure, Jesus, whatever you say, but we don't fill the water jar to the brim. We don't go all the way. We don't do it faithfully. We don't do it thoroughly. We don't do it generously. And we sit back wondering why we don't see God's power in our lives. Sometimes God's work in our lives is not evident, not because God is unable or unwilling, but because our obedience is incomplete. I've said this before, but so often, this is my own experience in my life. I, as your pastor, I spend time studying, I spend time preparing. I love to preach, I love to bring the message and explain God's word to you the best I can. But I'm usually very conscious that what I bring is only the water. It's only the water. I mean, I work hard, but generally what I have to offer you feels very watery to me. But God reminds me that all I have to do in faith and in obedience is prepare the water. It is the Spirit of God who will make that water into wine in the hearts of his people. You see, that's his job. And you wouldn't believe how many times I come here on a Sunday and I don't use this language, but I think all I've got for you is water this morning. All I've got is water. It's not anything new. It's not anything profound. It's not necessarily of great value, but I pray, Lord, I've done what you've told me to do. I've prepared to the brim. I've done the best I can. Now I'm pouring out the water, and God, will you make it into wine in the hearts of your people? And maybe for you as a parent, you feel just like that. That you're doing the best you can, to bring up your children, but at the end of the day, you feel like you're a pretty watery mum or dad. But you do the best you can and you say, Lord, this is just water. Will you make it into wine? Maybe your marriage right now seems kind of watery, but as you bring it to the Lord and say, Jesus, will you be Lord in our relationship? Will you be Lord of this marriage? It may feel watery now, but he will turn that into wine. Maybe at school or in your family or at your place of work, thinking about your own witness, as a Christian in those places. Maybe you kind of feel like you have a pretty watery witness. You're doing the best you can, but you feel kind of watery about your witness. Lord, all you're asking me to do is to bring the water, and he will produce the wine. When we understand that, it takes a lot of the pressure off us in those situations, right? Because we spend a lot of time trying to produce wine when it's not our job. Our job is to fill the jar. Our job is to pour out the water. Our job is to be our best, bring full obedience to what Jesus commands, and let him produce the wine from our watery efforts. And isn't that great to know? Isn't that a great relief to know that that's his work, that the outcome of obedience is his work. Don't try to make the wine. Bring the water and let God do what he will do. That's all we're called to do. And the third thing that I'd say from this miracle that we're looking at today, firstly, when Jesus goes to do something extraordinary, he usually begins with a command. Secondly, when he gives that command, we need to make sure we follow it fully, fill the jars to the brim. And then thirdly, when we obey him, trust him. When you obey him, trust him. Now, this is fundamental to the Christian life. We understand that. We sing that little Sunday school song, right? Trust and obey. I'm not going to sing anymore, but you know it's going to go around in your head for the next few days. There's two essential ingredients in the Christian life: obedience to him and our dependence upon him, trusting in him. They go hand in hand, obedience and trust, obedience and depending upon him. It's not just obedience, I'll do what you say, and then hopefully by obeying you, I'll make things work out. No. It's not just obedience. It's in obedience, we trust in him. We depend on him for the outcome. You see, these servants, they weren't responsible for making the wine. That wasn't their responsibility. That's not what Jesus had told them to do. Their job was to deal with the everyday water. Fill the jars with water. That's what they were instructed to do. But in their obedience to him, there was necessarily a dependence upon him for the outcome. The wine was his responsibility, not theirs. And it's not your responsibility. It's not my responsibility. As you obey him, as you trust him for the outcome. This is such a liberating truth for us in the Christian life. We spend too much time thinking that we're responsible for the outcome, and we're not. Jesus is. We're responsible for our obedience to him. He is responsible for the outcome. And it takes pressure off us because some of us are trying to produce wine ourselves. We're trying to produce the outcome that only Jesus can produce. The servants, they only put water in a jar. And when it was poured out into the glasses of the people, it became wine. Now, it probably took some courage for that first person, that first servant, to take that jug of water and to pour it in the master's glass, knowing that what they had put in there was water, not knowing what the outcome was going to be. It probably took some courage. It took trust. It took dependence upon the person commanding them to do that task, to be obedient to that. Because as far as they knew, all they were carrying was a jug of water. Sometimes you might feel extremely nervous about obeying God. I don't think I can do it, Jesus. I don't think I have what it takes. But as you obey him, as you trust him and pour it out, the water that was your responsibility, in obedience to God's command, it becomes wine. And God does something that you or I could never do. And there are some great lessons in this for us. There are some great principles for us to grab hold of that can transform the joy in our serving of Jesus if we get hold of these concepts. Great principles, but at the end of studying this passage, I'm kind of left with the question, why did Jesus do that miracle? Why did he do that? I mean, was he being obedient to his mother's request? Is that why he turned the water into wine? Did he take pity on the host of the wedding? Is that why he turned water into wine? Or was this his gift to the newly married couple? Is that why he did it? Well, I don't think those are the answers. In fact, those don't satisfy my curiosity on this at all. But if we read a little further, in verse 11, we're given this. What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which, now listen to this, the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory and his disciples believed in him. His disciples put their faith in him. That is, they recognized who he was. He had revealed his glory, his godness, if I can put it that way, his divinity. He revealed who he was. Now, it's important to make this clear. They did not put their faith in his ability to turn water into wine. They weren't trusting that okay, every time we run out of wine, this is the guy who can fix that. That wasn't what they were believing in. That wasn't what they were trusting in. They weren't putting their faith in his ability to turn water into wine. In fact, there's no record that he ever did that again. And it's not about putting our faith in him for something. Now, sometimes we use that language, right? Sometimes we say, I'm believing God for, and then we put our shopping list at the end of that sentence. It's not about believing for something, it's about believing in someone. They put their faith in him. Whatever he wants us to do, trust him. Whatever he says, I'll do it fully, depending on him for the outcome, because that's his responsibility. You see, there's this great list of men and women who lived by faith. In Hebrews chapter 11, it's a classic chapter in the New Testament, looking back through mostly the Old Testament, heroes of the Old Testament who did this by faith and they did this by faith, and it lists them off. For instance, it says, Hebrews 11:32, and what more shall I say? This is after 32 verses of all of these people that did all these things by faith. And what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon and Barak and Simpson and Jephthah, about David and Samuel and the prophets who through faith conquered kingdoms and administered justice and gained what was promised. Take notice of that sentence there. And gained what was promised. Who shut the mouths of lions and quenched the fury of the flames and escaped the edge of the sword. Whose weakness was turned to strength and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. This is like a joyful champion kind of passage. Women received their dead raised to life again. This sounds great. This is kind of heroes of the faith stories that we can get excited about. But then he goes on to say this. There were others. I mean, those are the good stories. But there were others who were tortured. Some facing jeers and flogging, chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawn in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and in holes in the ground. And listen to this. These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised. See the early part? They received what had been promised. But these ones, none of them received what had been promised. You see, we might say to that person who was about to be sawn into two, have the faith of Daniel. You know, Daniel in the lion's den, he had the faith that God would shut the mouths of the lions. You know, you're about to be sawn into two. Just trust God to stop the saw. But the thing is, in their case, he didn't. They were sawn in two. There was great persecution of God's people, and they suffered and died. You see, our faith is not prescriptive. Our faith is not telling God what to do or how to behave. Lord, I'm going to trust you to do this. That's not, our faith isn't prescriptive. It doesn't tell God. Sometimes God shows us what he's going to do, and then we can trust him to do what he said he would do. But what happened here in John chapter 2 is that he revealed his glory, and his disciples put their faith in him. They didn't put their faith in him to make life easy for them. They didn't put their faith in him to provide all of the joys and the newest things in life. They put their faith in him. We're going to trust in this man, in Jesus, the Son of God, the Messiah, the one who was sent from heaven to earth, lived a perfect life. We put our trust in him. What they knew was, however ordinary they were, or however ordinary they felt, or however ordinary life was, however ordinary the circumstances of life might be, this is the one in whom we put our faith. And in this one, because he makes the ordinary extraordinary. That's why you can go back to work and you can go back to school and you can go back to your home fully aware of the ordinariness of our lives, fully aware of the wateriness of our lives, and say, Jesus, I'm trusting in you today. Here's the water. I'll do whatever you tell me to do. I'll do it wholeheartedly and to the brim. I'll do whatever you tell me to do. I'll do it as fully as I know how. I'll fill the jars all the way to the top. I'll even pour it out into the cup of the master of the banquet, just the water, and I'll leave it up to you, Jesus, to make that water into wine. You see, we serve a God who specializes in turning the ordinary wateriness of our lives into the extraordinary when we depend upon him, when we live by faith, when we trust in him day by day. Let's put our faith in him. Let's trust not in what we think he will do or what we want him to do. Let's put our faith in him, Jesus, the author and the perfecter of our faith, the Son of God who came to give his life as a ransom for many. He revealed his glory. And I want to ask you today, have you seen the glory of Jesus? Because if you have, you'll be transformed by that and you will worship him for who he is and for what he has done for us. Let us pray together now. Heavenly Father.
Hey, if you want to know what's going on in the church, I just want to encourage you to check out our Facebook and our Instagram page. And if you're not on either of those, that's all right. You can go to our website. It's life-church.org.au. And while you're there, I encourage you press that prayer button and know that if you do that and you submit a prayer, that's absolutely going to be prayed for by us as pastors. Love you guys, and we'll see you next week.